Welcome to my final video of my Bond series, where I finish with Pierce Brosnan and get up to date on the Daniel Craig movies. First is Die Another Day, the last Pierce Brosnan movie from 2002. Directed by Lee Tamahall on a budget of 140 million. It managed to make 431 million, but with that budget, I think they were probably expecting more. And this is the first Bond movie post 9/11, so you'd think that may be taken into account, but they don't even come close to mentioning anything like that. It is about terrorists, it's about North Korean terrorists though, and it's absolute nonsense. The whole thing is just incomprehensible, really. They add a sci-fi element to it that just doesn't make sense, with the completely changing of the person's appearance to make a North Korean general's son to look like Toby Stevens, and his associate gets diamonds stuck in his face. Why can you completely change someone's appearance but you can't do the plastic surgery to remove diamonds from someone's face? Doesn't make any sense. It starts quite well with Bond being taken prisoner, and that works quite well with his interaction with M and his questions of trust, but then that also just means it becomes another revenge movie like all of these have since Roger Moore left, really. They do add an American element, which I guess you have to after 2001, but it's Halle Berry's Jinx Johnson, a CIA agent who's just a girl Bond, and it's not a very good character. Halle Berry does fine, but she does sexy, she does a little bit of fighting well, she does damsel in distress. It's just not really much to it. And Bond himself, after being held prisoner, he comes out, he's angry, he feels old, and then he quickly turns into unstoppable, unbeatable. And the way they depict that is through terrible CGI. Really, really bad. I don't know why they went for such ambitious things when the CGI just wasn't there. But they're copying movies like late 90s, early 2000s Star Trek movies and a little bit of a Michael Bay. They go for a bit of Con Air. The plot kind of takes from Face Off. So it's taking these late 90s action movies and just throwing extra CGI on it, and it does not work. Some of the CGI is just really awful. I mean, if you're going to copy some action from this time period, first Lord of the Rings just came out. Go for that. That is hands-on, real stuntmen and actors and props. None of this CGI riding a wave caused by a satellite breaking apart a glacier. It doesn't make any sense. So the tone is just warped because it's no longer a Bond film. It's now a weird sci-fi thing. Even towards the end, the bad guy, Gustav Graves, is wearing a bodysuit that makes him look like a character from Guyver. It's just really not Bond. It's just lame. And this comes across in some of the dialogue, some of the images, some of the shots are genuinely bad. Some of the references to earlier Bond are awful. I didn't hate this as much as I thought I was going to, and it sounds like I did, but it's just lame. It's more disappointing than anything else. This comes from the very beginning. They messed up the barrel. How do you mess up the barrel? But they managed. One element I did like was to point out how lame Britain is, which had been hinted at since the 1970s, and to do it again in a post-Soviet world, you need to do it at some point. Then we had a nice 4-year gap. And gaps do well in Bond series because they get to take their time with a script. So they brought back Martin Campbell to direct, who had done so well reinventing Bond for GoldenEye. They gave him 150 million to work with. They kept the same writers, Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, who had worked on The World Is Not Enough and carried on to the present. But they got other writers in, and for 2006 Casino Royale, they got Paul Haggis, off the success of Oscar winner Crash, to come in and do some editing. Mostly he rewrote the finale. But the key to Casino Royale is that they've copied very different movies. Whereas Die Another Day had copied 90s action movies, which didn't make any fucking sense. Con Air is nonsense. Why copy Con Air? Casino Royale has copied really high quality action movies like Black Hawk Down, and most notably The Bourne Supremacy. There's elements of Spider-Man here, there's plenty of Guy Ritchie and Matthew Vaughn type elements. In fact, Matthew Vaughn had been offered to direct this one, but there are elements here that really work. And you take that action, which looks good, well choreographed, and add it to a story that actually is worth telling and a Bond that is interesting. And you've got what is one of the best Bond movies, easily top 5. It is good. It starts well, and there are moments right from the beginning that make you know this is going to be something different. And so much of this works really, really well. Not just the script, which does its callbacks to earlier Bond, but does them well. Notably the vodka martini, it's a good twist on it. The Bond, James Bond, comes at the end, real great moment. But they've really invested in other elements as well. The casting of Eva Green as Vesper Lind, brilliant actress playing what could have been quite a simple role, and she adds real gravitas to it, especially in the flirting scene on the train, and then when she has to feel real emotion. They've done the same as Never Say Never Again, got a very highly regarded European actor to come in and play the baddie. This time it's Mads Mikkelsen's Le Chiffre, and he is so good. Understated, but with elements of real danger that really come across well. He's kind of low-key, but capable of real anger and danger. Reminds me of Mr. Big from Live and Let Die. All the small characters are smart and well-written here. Felix is back, and Jeffrey Wright does quite well with that. Mathis, as the European agent who works with him, he's written well and he's acted well. He's a smart character as well. He's written to be smart, and so that all works well. But the key here is Bond. They've written Bond well. He's intriguing. He has character. He has an element of background that's worth exploring because this is his origin story. But he's also vulnerable. There are countless examples in this where he literally fails. In the airport fight scene, he's chasing after him, and he has to jump off the truck because he's failed. Of course, he gets back on, but there is danger here. There is potential for him to fail. He loses the poker game. He has to get brought back in. He gets poisoned because he's not as smart as Le Chiffre is. And of course, the ending is a fail. He doesn't get what he wants. He gets double-crossed, and he can't even save Vesper at the end. This element really adds to the tension of the film, and it adds a sense of Bond as human, which had been really lost at the end of everyone's run. They became too superhuman. Die Another Day used CGI to make him superhuman and a ridiculous suit to make the villain superhuman. Here, they've gone for vulnerable human being who feels pain, makes mistakes, and it really benefits the film. Next, just 2 years later, Mark Foster made Quantum of Solace, and not only did they rush it because it's only 2 years, like so many other times, but there was another writer's strike, so they had to rush the draft. Paul Haggis handed in his finished draft 2 hours before the writer's strike started, and it shows, because what you've got is a continuation of some of the good ideas and a few of similar themes, but a complete collapse of some of the important elements. Instead of any sense of tension, it's just violence. It's the most violent Bond movie to date. There are 250 trivial or severely violent acts. If you compare that to Dr. No, which had 109. So it's twice as violent as the first Bond. And it's the shortest as well. So it's full of violence and action. The action scenes come every 10 minutes. There's no breaks. There's no rest period, except for the second act. It has slightly longer gaps, slightly shorter fights, but nothing to say. It's just a revenge movie. They add a Bond girl to justify exposition of revenge and to say what Bond is feeling. There's too much M involved in the actual story, where she should be more background. She's right there. And again, the movies it's copying, this time it's basically copying Transformers in some of its action. It's way over the top. There's brutal murder, excessive violence, and a villain that no one really cares about. There's nothing to that character. He's supposed to be the normal face of corruption and greed in this destroy the water supply or steal the water supply plot. So it's a comic book plot.
Green isn't after the oil. He wants the water.
With excessive violence and a lame villain. Dominic Green does his best, but there's nothing really he can do. And the references to earlier Bond are stark and lame. Gemma Arterton is killed with oil the same way Shirley Eaton was in Goldfinger. It's not subtle. It's not particularly clever because the movie is actually saying that oil is not most important, so it's contradicting itself. Some of the things the director came out with are just contradictory as well. Trying to make the bad guy more realistic, but is still absurd. His quick rise to billionaire philanthropist status, it's just not justified. None of it is justified. None of the action is really justified. None of the progression of scenes is justified. There's a brief chat about Vesper at one point, and then they drag it out at the end. But the second act, it just goes on. There are whole scenes. He goes to see M and then escapes the hotel, and nothing has actually been achieved. It's just to bring M back into the story and try and justify, but it doesn't at all. Nothing changes. And they spent 200 million on this one. So it's all there in just explosions and a few decent sets. But it just feels like it's rushed, feels like it needed another rewrite, another example of action and exposition together, but neither of them work. It just makes most of them boring. Some of the CGI is not great. It looks like Transformers, but Bond is not a Transformer. He's supposed to be a human, so he's supposed to do realistic things. This is so far from running across live crocodiles in Live and Let Die. It's just so disappointing after all the hard work of Casino Royale and a decent first act, really, then a dragging second act, and then a ridiculous action sequence at the end where there's no tension. Okay, she might die, but she'll die in this fake fire. There's way too much fire for them to be moving around, for running through it. It's just not believable. You don't feel any sense of how is he going to do that? Oh, he's just going to run through fire, of course. Next, you have Sam Mendes directing Skyfall. And this movie, again, given 200 million, and it made over $1 billion at the box office. They got John Logan in to write with Purvis and Wade instead of Paul Haggis. They got Academy Award winner Thomas Newman to do the music. They got the legendary Roger Deakins to do cinematography. So they're really trying here. And it's critically lauded. A lot of people say it's the best. It does have a lot of good going for it, but it's not perfect. It's far from being perfect. Again, it's a revenge movie. Instead of revenge for his dead girlfriend, now it's someone else getting revenge against M. Fine. Bond is over the Vesper thing now, so he's gruff, but he's pained. He's not emotionally volatile anymore, but he's still capable of pain. He's not got the rage of late Brosnan or Dalton. He's not got the arrogance of Roger Moore, but there's a pain there. There's a grittiness, a gruffness to it.
Skyfall.
The best things about this is definitely Deakins' cinematography and Javier Bardem's villain. His Raul Silva is treated really, really well. And this was 2012, a 4-year gap between the movies, so they had time to write Bardem's character well. And his introduction is one of the best scenes in all the Bond movies. It's slowly approaching from this tiny little thing in the distance, telling this anecdote that they've really tried to fill with nuance, and it's dripping with allegory, and it works really well. But the final act of this movie is nonsense. It starts with a terrible opening because it's just more Transformers. There's several moments that just look like a Michael Bay movie. Him running on the digger, smashing the train, that feels like a Transformers movie. And then he fixes his cuff, which is as bad as fixing your cuff underwater. It's just not a good use of that. It's supposed to be there for him to go, doesn't matter. Not, oh, look at me, I'm James Bond doing Michael Bay stunts. It's a really poor moment. Then you've got Adele desperately trying to salvage what's just happened by literally singing what is happening, which is a trope of Bond songs, but it feels extra stark here. Yeah, I love it, but it's mostly just because of Adele singing, not because of the song. Then you've got proper spy elements. It feels like a spy movie. The introduction of Q's not great. It's constantly trying to distance itself from the old life, but also salvage that. So it's actually confusing which one it wants to do. Is it trying to dismiss them like Q says? Or is it wrong to dismiss them like the Tory minister at the inquiry says? It can't make up its mind. And then the final third is way too long, way too Home Alone, way too bullshit about Bond that doesn't matter, doesn't really make any difference. It's supposed to make us care about him, but he doesn't react to any of it. He doesn't do anything. And the final act turns Javier Bardem's Raul Silva into the Joker. He has this, okay, computer hacker way of escaping. I'll let them have that. But then he's running away. He has to take evasive action because Bond's pursuing him. How is the train in the right place at the right time? That doesn't make any sense. That works in a comic book if you've got the Joker who gets away with all of this stuff. This is a Bond movie. You shouldn't have Joker elements for the villain. So many times it's been too over the top. This is just too specific in what he's doing, and it doesn't really work at all. So they've done really, really well. Bullshit opening, great song, great spy movie, overall nonsense ending. And M dying doesn't make the entire movie pointless. And the last one made, Spectre, 2015. So it's a 3-year gap. But I think most of that was spent trying to find the director, because should Sam Mendes return? Should he not? Tried a bunch of other people. Mendes eventually said yes, and they gave him $245 million. Turns out that was well spent because it made 880, but I think that comes from Skyfall, really, because Spectre's not a good movie. There are good elements to it, the idea is good, finally taking something relevant to the world in surveillance. Edward Snowden's leaks came out in 2013, so it's contemporaneous. The first act works like a spy film, it's good. Ralph Fiennes is good as the new M, that interaction is good. Andrew Scott is great, but I don't really get the point of his character. There's a sense of the scope of Spectre as an organisation, but that kind of doesn't really sell. It's trying to connect to the Quantum Group and to Le Chiffre and completely ruin Raul Sylvia from Skyfall by saying he worked for Spectre. That's bullshit. That shouldn't be. He should be free to do that. Leah Seydoux does well as the Bond girl, adding any emotion because you've got Bond playing this stoic now, which works for his story. So I don't have him as an issue in this, but it's the way that it's written in some of the scenes. He has a contempt for danger. That's fine, but it's the way that so does the movie. There's no consequences for his actions because he can just get away with it. It's like running into the fire in Quantum of Solace. Here he can be on a collapsing building and land on a sofa, and he can easily escape from Spectre in his car. 2 guys go after him. It's all of Spectre. Why only 2 guys? His plane should explode or at least veer off course, and of course it doesn't. It's the perfect toboggan. So there's no tension here because the universe is guiding Bond and physics won't let him get really hurt. The main thing of this one, of course, is that it's Spectre. They've finally got the rights to the book Thunderball after a 50-year battle. So they go for the Spectre, and I feel like they've thrown it in because they shouldn't have, because they didn't need to. They'd set up Quantum as a thing. Okay, Quantum is part of Spectre, fine. But if they even tried to justify it a bit more, Le Chiffre would have worked, but they did Raul Sylvia. That is a separate thing, an outside thing. That being attached to Spectre doesn't work. And then you bring in Blofeld, who has been cartoonish at times. So what do? You bring in a great actor, a great European actor. This is what they do. Christoph Waltz, brilliant actor, but here it's crap. It's absolute rubbish. It's the same as Raul Sylvia. There's the homoeroticism. There's the backstory connection to Bond this time instead of M. There's the fact that he can do anything Joker style. And then the final third of this movie is absolute nonsense. And Bond escapes too easily. It's Blofeld can do all of this. Why has he set up this terrible torture thing? The drill doesn't even work. The second act just drags, and the third act is just bonkers. And the callbacks again are rubbish. Why is Moneypenny now a secretary? She was a field agent in the last one. Why would she go to secretary? That doesn't make any sense. Forcing in 2 Aston Martins is... it got blown up in the last one. Why have they rebuilt it? Why not buy another one or a different car? The Vespa references, trying to make this some sort of saga that just shouldn't be. I want him to have mourning, but don't force it in. The best bit was him going to Tracy's grave in The Spy Who Loved Me. That one worked. They throw in the Rolls Royce, which is the same one as in From Russia with Love. And so the action here, they're not gone for Transformers, but it's still just copying other contemporaneous movies. Here it's Christopher Nolan, very much so copying Christopher Nolan in some of his major set pieces, like from Inception in the snowy landscapes. The opening feels like Transformers, or The Hobbit. If you want to copy a terrible movie for its action, just copy The Hobbit's falling forever. Here it's James Bond falling and somehow not getting hurt. It's the callbacks that are so obvious that they don't work, and hornshoeing things in that they shouldn't, and terrible third acts. That's the problem with some of these movies. Definitely the problem here. Get Christopher Waltz and you don't use him properly and make a farce at the end. So you can dismiss Die Another Day as the end of a very negative era that doesn't work with a British spy. It's much more an American Ubermensch hero. And you focus on the Daniel Craig ones. Casino Royale does really well to create this mood and this sense of vulnerability to Bond that's been desperately lacking. Then they rush Quantum of Solace. Writing is bad. The baddie is bad. There's so many things that just don't work. So you try again. Skyfall, really invest in talent, and despite an opening that completely destroyed it for me the first time I saw it, does well to create a spy film and a spy story. Brilliant handling of the villain, and then a garbage ending with Joker and Home Alone. And then they make the same mistakes again with Spectre. Tries and fails. Final third is bad. Forcing elements. I think the problem with Bond, and has been all the way through the series, is that it just takes popular stuff and adds it to the Bond formula and just lets it go. The problem with that is Bond is a boring character. So you add backstory like Skyfall and Spectre, you end up not believing it because no one cares where Bond comes from. We don't care why, we only care how. These movies are about how. How will Bond beat the bad guy? How will Bond get the girl? How will he survive? And how will he do it without ruining everything for everyone else? The best thing about Casino Royale is not the opening action set piece, as good as it is, but is the consequence of it. Straining of relationship with M, who is always the most important guidance force in these movies. It works there. So the usual way they invigorate Bond is through adding a new popular element. This is usually most obvious through the music. I think Roger Moore's smarming his way through voodoo beats, kung fu fighting and disco. After Die Another Day copied the most absurd sci-fi of the late 90s, the reboot took more serious action as its inspiration. Bourne Supremacy, Christopher Nolan, then accidentally or not copies The Hobbit and Transformers and other Michael Bay movies. There's nothing inherently wrong with this, but it's important how you integrate Bond elements into what matters. Casino Royale does all this really well. Skyfall doesn't. Casino Royale does the drink, the my name's Bond, puts them into part of the story, and it works. In Skyfall, Q is a joke, and that doesn't make any sense. Moneypenny is an action hero who becomes a secretary. It doesn't fit, really. The question on the audience's mind isn't how. How will Bond save the day? But how will they shoehorn in an Aston Martin with ejector seats? The answer to this is more often than not, badly. The story is lost in these obvious moments. It's the difference between fixing your tie on a stationary tank after an explosion nowhere near you and fixing your tie underwater. Another example of why the how is so important is the opening scene of Spectre. All through the older movies, especially the Connery ones, Bond does things slowly, quietly, like a spy. This is the fashion of 60s movies, and new technical abilities mean Bond can do whatever he wants now. But it was key to the older Bond movies, because what Bond does is fucking difficult. And those scenes show it. Climbing the building in Diamonds Are Forever is difficult. Climbing on the oil rig is difficult. Infiltrating Dr. No's base is difficult. Daniel Craig does everything so fast. There are moments that slow down, but the key elements where the film is trying to show Bond through his actions, trying to establish who he is, they get it wrong. And the opening shot of Spectre is a good example. It's a great big Touch of Evil one-shotter that goes from the streets and a carnival into the hotel, up a lift, into the bedroom where he kisses this anonymous girl, onto the roof and into position to kill. It lasts 4 minutes and 5 seconds and it looks fantastic. But what's the point? The point is that this is difficult for the filmmakers to achieve. Not Bond. He never breaks his stride, which makes it even more challenging for the camera operator. But it's just him walking. And then with the explosion, you have absurd action that looks like a Transformers movie, or worse, The Hobbit, just falling but miraculously not getting hurt. There should be no miracles in a Bond movie. The closest to a miracle should be Q's gadgets. But here he falls, rocks disappear, and he lands on a sofa. He gets up and fixes his jacket. This is not Bond. You can't just add a cuff to Transformers and call it Bond. This scene should have been Bond struggling to get the right shot. Do it in one shot, sure, fantastic, but it should be as difficult for Bond as it is for the filmmakers. You could even do the same one shot, but after, as stuff is collapsing around him, he needs to jump. Show his eyes, knowing this jump is absurd, that it is risky, it is difficult, slow him down, shit collapses around him, have him jump, and just make it. Then he gets up, fixes his cuff as if to say, piece of cake. That is Bond. Those moments of his character, the facade hiding his emotions, his fear, relief, guilt, shame, pain, whatever. It's why John McClane started as such an effective hero. It's achieving something realistically, knowing the risk, seeing the risk. That's tension. They made the same mistake at the start of Skyfall, jumping on the train and fixing his cuff. It takes away from the moment. He might as well be fixing his tie underwater. If you compare that with Casino Royale, where the insane action is difficult and painful and effective for Bond, he's not the best. The guy jumps through the tiny little window, so he just barges through the wall. Because Bond has to do these things. Because he's not perfect. He can't do these miracles. Then you got the poker game. He loses. He has to jump off the truck. He loses Vesper. He loses again and again and again in Casino Royale. Fail after fail after fail. But he perseveres and finds a way. The parkour chase ends with Bond making a bad choice, and he and M suffer the consequences for it. Casino Royale did so well at making the world have consequences, potentially negative, and thus adding tension, whereas in Spectre doesn't. The one moment of him failing is immediately ruined by the awful torture scene and the simplest of escapes. Why doesn't the drill work by taking away his memory? It's supposed to. The point of Bond is to show these ridiculous things, these amazing stunts, and this unbelievable charm. He's smarter at the right moment. He's got the quickest mind. He notices the right thing because he's a spy. He's supposed to be a spy defeating these people who don't think of these elements because they're thinking too big about their megalomaniac schemes. It should be the little things that save him, not miracles. If you need a miracle, that's what Q's for. Add some tech that the bad guys don't have, or some tech that becomes amazingly convenient. I've never had a problem with giving James Bond a laser in his watch and then having him manacled. Fine, of course. Next time, don't mention the laser, but it's probably there and he doesn't need it. Fine, I don't care. But you can't have miracles outside of that, and you can't have this disconnect from what you're really trying to do. You can't just have Bond doing a Christopher Nolan movie or Bond doing a Kung Fu movie. You can't just shoehorn these things in. If you're going to reference earlier Bond, be careful with it. If you're going to add a new element from popular culture, justify it. The ones that have a few years between it and the previous one are the ones that are written well enough to be careful with these elements. It focuses on how Bond can do it and not that he will. So to finish, I'll give you my top three, and because I like variety, it's going to have three different Bonds. So it's going to be Sean Connery's From Russia with Love, proper Bond spy movie, some great elements, excellent villains. GoldenEye, brilliant revamp, felt like a proper 90s movie in the good sense, as opposed to the terrible ideas that came later. And a Bond that you could get behind, and an M that justified things. And Casino Royale, which is actually a good movie in itself, adds a few Bond elements that work really well. The good formula for villain, excellent European actor. Eva Green's Bond girl is definitely one of the best. And Bond is vulnerable in this movie. The best moments are when he is. The end of On Her Majesty's Secret Service is one of the best moments in the series. GoldenEye is about him not being the best 00 because Alec got one over on him. These elements are so important, and all through Roger Moore you never felt any real tension, except for the stuntmen, because some of those stunts were insane and amazing, even if filmed terribly, but you gotta give it to the stuntmen. The worst one is gonna remain A View to a Kill. I hadn't seen Die Another Day, so I'd heard a lot of terrible things. It is terrible, but not nearly as bad as I'd feared, so I let it get away with a lot. None of the Daniel Craig movies come close to being the worst, although maybe some of the most disappointing. And I think I'll add who is my favourite Bond. If you've listened to the other videos, you probably can guess it's Sean Connery.
Bond. James Bond.
His Bond is what Bond should be, hiding his emotions, being somewhat vulnerable. No need for this excessive exploration of Bond emotion. Just have him respond to the film he's in. That's enough. He was the best with the quips, he was the best with the intro, he was the best just at walking. So finally I'm done. Thank you for joining me through this journey of Bond, and I'll be back with more videos soon.